Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist. Join me as I seek out the small incremental changes being applied in other industries that we can learn from and that can be applied in healthcare. Can these changes bring immediate value, but also add up to the big improvements and revolution we need in healthcare? Come along with me to explore the possibilities. My innovative guests from around the globe have used small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by Kevin McGrail. He's a local IT tech entrepreneur and director of business growth at InfrasShield. Kevin, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Dr. Nick. It's my pleasure.
So you and I met some time ago, and one of the things that really stood out to me is you're very unique in a whole range of areas, but the one I wanted to talk about initially was this rare disease and the challenges that you've had through the healthcare system. That's been a journey of personal discovery. Tell us a little bit about both what it is and your pathway through this and what it took to get to where you are today talking to me.
Wow. So that is a big topic. I'll try and I think pick maybe some specific points that are most relevant. But so in 2015, I was at Mach 37, which is a cybersecurity accelerator. I was running a startup and started losing weight unexpectedly. By the end of that fall, the accelerator was going quite well. It's an amazing incubator. And on top of that, they're victims of their own success. They get some of the best business leaders and talkers and speakers in the world to come in. And it got so crazy, I couldn't even go to the doctors anymore. But the day after I graduated, I literally shook the hand of the governor, got my graduation certificate, and left there, went to go to the doctors, and they said, "Oh, your gallbladder's bad," and had that taken out a few days later, but never recovered from that surgery. And it turned out that that was a symptom more than the cause. And I ended up by May of 2016 basically being incapacitated. I was effectively unable to walk, talk, or see. I was transferred to Hopkins, and they diagnosed me with a very rare disorder. For those here, it's anti-DPPX paraneoplastic syndrome or paraneoplastic neurological syndrome, depending on who you talk to. It's a syndrome that causes a lot of symptoms. In my particular case, it led to a lot of initial things, weight loss, like you heard. One of the fancy named syndromes or symptoms is called dysautonomia, which is basically when your autonomic system stops working correctly. So that was where the weight loss was coming from, things like that. And a little later in June, after I started treatment, I actually lost my heart, to some extent. I was down to, for the doctors who might be listening, I was at my wife took my blood pressure, I was at 40/30 with a 30 heartbeat. And she was an EMT for many years. She thought her equipment was broken. She went to go get another one. They called 911. The paramedics came. By that time, I had the adrenaline surging. So my my blood pressure was up to 50/40, at which point the medics thought their equipment was broken, and they went to go get another one and called a helicopter and things like that. So anyway, it's been a journey, but one of the things I do like talking about is how I got through it, especially with my wife. She was a very, very stalwart advocate. I would not be here without her today. Lots of Kafka-esque stories in the healthcare, not necessarily wrong ones, but just what happened. I don't know how much you want me to talk about that, but I can talk about some of the systems that work, some of the systems that failed. I can talk about some of the things in business. What parachutes worked there, what parachutes failed in my business, and how it affected my startup and things like that. So, where would you like me to go on the path?
So I think I want to start around that sort of initial diagnosis. I mean, in the first instance, it was a sort of broad brush. Oh, you've got the following constellation of symptoms. Let's take out your gallbladder, which, in hindsight proves to be a poor choice at best. You, I know, have spent a lot of time researching this, and just share with the listeners the statistics of the numbers of patients in this category or grouping of disease.
Yeah, so it's not big. I'm one of 39 diagnosed in the world. So I'm patient number one and the only patient at Hopkins. I don't believe there's been any new diagnoses in a couple of years now. And I'm pretty sure, not 100% sure, but we'll say 90% sure, I was either one of the first or the first diagnosed from a medical test. Before that, most of the paraneoplastics had been diagnosed by what's called differential diagnosis, which is a fancy way of saying we ruled everything else out, you must have this. And that is an interesting journey of itself. So you can imagine over many, many months, the number of tests that I had and blood tests, and especially in the traditional health system, you know, go have this test, come back in a month, we'll tell you what it said, kind of journey that occurred.
So, you know, you're a scientist, you're a computer scientist, you're an analytical kind of individual. As you look back on that, bearing in mind that this is rare, so there's not a lot of people, but you know, the one thing that we talk about a lot in medicine, I don't know if you've heard this term, is zebra hunting. So when you hear, you know, hooves, think zebras, not horses, not because they're common, but because you need to make sure you rule that out. But how do we get to that? What was the pathway that got you to this diagnosis? Was there an inflection point in your own personal experience, or in the experience of the medical folks, or even with your wife participating in that allowed for that other people could learn from? Because I know I sort of go through this on a regular basis thinking, wow, is this, you know, common or rare? You know, do I have pneumonia or do I just have a cold? It's a simple example. Where are the sort of divergent points that we can learn from that can get us to that answer quicker?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest thing that I've really saw was the difference between a world-class system like I was seen at and then a world-class system like Johns Hopkins, and what was the difference and how were they able to leap to the diagnosis so quickly. So there were a couple of things that helped them. So first of all, I had been through months of diagnosis. I had tons of test reports. I literally showed up with like a, you know, an office supply box full of reports and whatnot. On top of that, I think they were much more interdisciplinary. And I think that's if you were to ask me for the number one thing that I think we need to see an incremental change in, is something like patient advocates or interdisciplinary approaches. Because one of the things that's happening is I was starting to get very ill. I'm starting to get to the point where I can't talk, I can't remember things, I'm ill. My wife is dealing with 3 kids and school and bills and a business and all the kind of stuff that's falling around us. And, you know, the traditional doctors will say, go get this test. They'll give you the results of the test and they'll say, go see this specialist. At which point you as a layperson, even on myself, my wife and I are very highly educated and interested in learning and, you know, scientifically based. You know, we have to then go and try and play operator, as I call it, to recant what the other doctor said to this next doctor or specialist to try and get them to understand what's going on. And, you know, you might have 5 minutes to do that in, which is not always sufficient. You're not going to remember it. So for me, you know, the journey was very, very spotty. I don't abuse drugs. I've never done an illegal drug in my life. I don't drink except occasionally, maybe 50, 60 drinks a year. But, you know, some people who know me were very surprised to find out that at one point I was diagnosed as anorexic nervosa, which is, let me just say, I don't fit any of the profile for that. I was diagnosed as having possibly Korsakov's, which is people get that from drinking a gallon of vodka a day. I was diagnosed, they threatened to either involuntarily commit me or voluntarily go into the outpatient program. You know, otherwise they would involuntarily commit me because they were sure that I was doing illegal drugs because nothing else would explain it. So that I think was one of the biggest problems that I had, is that there is one moment that I can tell you that basically started the journey. Otherwise was there were 2 situations going on. So first of all, one, you know, when you live with somebody, you don't always see how badly they're degrading. That's been one of the things that came up. And by the fall of 2015, I was largely unable to function for more than 8 hours in a day. And by that time, I was ready to collapse. Any type of chore, making pasta for 10, 15 minutes was just absolutely overwhelming to me. So those kind of things started to become a problem, and obviously caused a lot of fights with my wife and things like that because, and then I got the gallbladder surgery and they were like, okay, now he's going to be fixed. And I was like, no, I don't feel better. I'm not getting better. I can't eat food still. And this eventually led to me getting to a doctor to have an EMG. And I don't remember what that's something something graph.
Myogram. Yep.
Myogram.
Awesome.
And that's the one where they stab you with needles and hit you with small electrical shocks and see how your body reacts. And this particular doctor did not have I don't mind it because I'm very analytical, but he didn't have the greatest bedside manner. He actually asked my wife if I'd ever had a job and if I'd ever been employed. And my wife at that point broke down because that was where she kind of realized that, okay, this is a guy who started a company, when he was in his 20s. I'm trying to remember what year it even was. So I was 20 when I started it. Ran a company, have many people who depend on me, et cetera. And now I'm at a doctor's office where they're asking if I've ever had a job. So fairly degraded on the situation. And then he did the test, and it was supposed to be an hour and a half long EMG. And 20 minutes into it, he canceled it and sent me to the ER because he had never seen a test that had done it before. And so my wife actually refers to him as Dr. House because he's just very blunt. But I think in a similar vein, he's not saying anything to be mean. He's saying it to get to the root of the problem. And that's a very interesting thing that sometimes, there's a balance between being warm and fuzzy and being cold and getting the damn diagnosis done. So sometimes you need to realize that. But he's actually the doctor who thought I had Korsakov's. He sent me for a thiamine drip. And at that time, and for those of you guys who know EMGs, my left side and right side were firing offset each other by almost a half a second. And I was firing in some cases 1.25 seconds, so 1250 milliseconds sometimes for the firings. That's just an insanely long time for an EMG. So anyway, that's why he thought I had Korsakov's. He sent me over for a thiamine drip at the ER, which, by the way, is amazing. I think it's vitamin D or B, I think. Oh my gosh, I felt the best I'd felt in a year. I literally, I don't think I slept for 3 days. I was doing everything I hadn't been able to do for a year. And then I crashed completely. And unfortunately, they had done an electrolytes test before they gave me the thiamine. So they were able to unfortunately come back and tell me I did not have Korsakov's. And that was not good news. But he started the concept, what I call, of going off the diagnostics tree, because previously they had done this diagnostics tree. The hospital chain that I was at had marked me down as drug-seeking behavior, which was absolutely inane. I have owned my own company. I have a psychiatrist. I have a psychologist. And the only drug test I ever failed for them in the bazillion tests they ever did for me was for Oxycontin, which I had like 3 of when they took my gallbladder out. So, if anybody's ever had surgery, you know how many blood tests they do before and after, et cetera. So anyway, it was a little insane. But this guy was the first guy. He's like, something's wrong. I don't know what. It's not what they think it is. And so he later apologized to me because I called him and we thanked him and whatnot. And he said he was sorry because he had read my papers and saw the drug-seeking behavior, and that's why he jumped to Korsakov's. But we told him, not to worry about that because for the most part, he was the first person who had said, okay, they're way on the wrong path. You need to go do something. You're very, very ill. You need to go to the ER, et cetera. And so he was the first one trying to really, think outside the box. And that was probably the most relevant thing. And so that led to a chain of events, again, with my wife being a very vigilant, person. She was telling him while we were there, it's like, he doesn't drink. I wish he would, because then I'd drink less. Those kind of things, just telling, he's owned a company, et cetera. And really kind of getting through to these doctors that their diagnosis was wrong. And I would say the one thing I think I can take away, especially for the medical profession, is try and be more interdisciplinary and don't use your patients as messengers, because it doesn't work. I had a thought for another recommendation, but it just fleetingly left my head, of course. Hopefully it'll come back to me. So
No, that's great. So for those of you just joining, I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and today I'm delighted to be talking to Kevin McGrail. He is the Director of Business Growth at InfrasShield, and also a unique patient suffering from anti-DPPX paraneoplastic neurological disorder, one of a handful of patients in the world, sharing his story and some of his insights as to how we can improve that process. And I picked up a number of sort of not only incremental steps of that interdisciplinary approach and the patient engagement, but one of the things that the undercurrent there is getting out of the echo chamber of all of this information that we sort of listen and read, and then make assumptions that are inevitable. It's part of our inbuilt bias, and it's finding a pathway out. We don't teach that at medical school. It's one of my issues and bugbears. But getting back to the story, so you've now, having found the diagnosis, you've turned that around. I think you're improved, albeit it's imperfect, but you're able to manage. Is that a fair assessment?
so you're saying I'm not perfect? Is that what you're saying?
I would never say that about anybody, as you know.
So no, what I usually describe it as is mischief managed. As a Harry Potter reference. They know what I have. They know a reasonable treatment regimen. I'm very blessed to respond to the treatment. Sometimes the treatment's as bad as the disease. So I've had some symptoms and problems caused by that, but I did remember my other bugbear that I was going to tell you for the medical community. So, and this is a minor one, but I think it's sometimes mistaken by even doctors and certainly by lay people, is that a lot of medical tests cannot tell you things that people think they tell you. And what I mean by that is, I'm not 100% sure on this one, but I think it's a good example. It's like a strep test. If you go have a quick strep test, it can tell you for absolutely sure if you have strep. What it can't tell you is you don't have strep. And a lot of people think that a lot of medical tests are binary, yes or no, when they're not. They might be a no or they might be a yes, but they don't tell you anything unless they give you an answer. So that sometimes can delay things when you really kind of take it. And where I think it would have been a significant problem is I was seeing this at a very premier hospital chain that they were getting ready to do a paraneoplastic panel on me, and that panel would have come back and said I did not have paraneoplastic syndrome, and without a doubt, but of course unprovable, I can tell you that would have been very bad for me. And that test was scheduled 3 days before I ended up at Hopkins. And when I got to Hopkins, they came in, literally 20 doctors at least. They came in and said, okay, we've looked at your records, et cetera. It's like 7 p.m. at night. I'd gotten there that afternoon. So one day at Hopkins, they said, we looked at your records. We talked about it. We think you have a paraneoplastic syndrome. We want to start this treatment today because you'll be dead before we get the tests back. So, and they sent the tests off to Mayo. And I have a very dark sense of humor. So when they came back, they actually said I was positive for research. So I was like, oh no, I'm allergic to research. And they actually had to contact Mayo to find out what research test I had tested positive for, because it didn't even come back on the results. And so that was how they actually diagnosed it with anti-DPPX. And it's a very slow process with a lot of poor little rats that have to die, and hippocampuses that get serum put on it, and then they culture it. And I think at the time, for those who don't know, I think my test results came back like 1 in 15,000. And what that means is they predict they would have to dilute my serum 15,000 times to have the disease not present. They don't do it 15,000 times, but they do it a whole lot to get to that number. Yeah. So anyway, I do say mischief managed, and I have a good treatment plan.
You delve into another area of my passion, which is physics, and our inability to prove a negative, particularly around quantum mechanics, and so it absolutely pertinent point, especially in healthcare. A lot of these things are rule out but not rule in, or vice versa. So I think excellent areas of sort of exploration. We've got a limited amount of time, and I didn't want to sort of miss the opportunity to sort of cover a couple of other topics briefly before we run out. The first is you have a history in the security space. I think you grew up in an era when it was the Wild West, but in a positive way. It was a sort of exploratory. Just tell us briefly what were you doing? What was going on around that time, and what was your involvement in all of that?
Oh gosh, it was a long time ago, but it was a lot of fun. I really, I was very blessed to know that when I got a Christmas present one year of a Commodore 64, that I was from then on going to work in computers. And that turned out to be a good decision, but to put that in a frame of mind for most people, that was at the time when somebody who worked in computers probably made the equivalent of like a forest ranger. They do it because they love it, not because of the pay rewards. And I shortly after I got that, I got a modem. I started finding out what BBSs were. I started dialing around. I started, playing with things, becoming what is known as a hacker. In the, hacker originally wasn't really the negative term that it is today, because it just meant that you hacked around on stuff. It was more of an engineering term that said you played with something until you figured it out. You didn't really need a manual, that kind of stuff. And sometimes you figured out things it could do that it was never intended to do. That led into some security problems, some problems with the later on with the FBI and the phone systems and whatnot. But turn that around later on. Now I do security, and I do often talk about the fact that I have a little bit of evil in me, but it lets me figure out how to battle the bad guys and think about what they're going to do, and hopefully think about what they're going to do before they do it, so that I can really stop them. And it's a common problem I have. In fact, I have a lovely person who works for me. They have a master's in cybersecurity. And if I gave them a laptop, a printer, and a brand new router and an internet connection and said, hook it up in 5 hours, your life depends on it, I'd have to kill them at 5.5 hours because they couldn't do it. And from my standpoint, you can't secure a network if you can't build one. And going further, that gets you to like level 1 security. If you can't hack a network, you can't secure it at like the level 3. And I'm very proud of the work I do. We do high level, high value, high target systems that are, nuclear sector, nation state level stuff. We also do mom and pop things as well, but people don't, necessarily understand what the bad guys can do. And I'm at least happy to say that I stumbled into what bad guys did when I was very young and got to study it for the last 4 years.
I think you make an important point, and one that I repeat frequently with my security guests and hackers, and I agree with you. The hacking term just got co-opted for this negativity, and it's not. It's about exploration and understanding. And I think the important thing is putting yourself in the shoes of other people to understand the potential vectors and edges of the attack. Such an important area. We got a couple of minutes.
Yeah, for people who don't know, like the term I would use today that would equivalent is like the makers. If you've gone to a makers fair and things like that, that's more of like what the hacker culture was 40 years ago.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. So we got a couple of minutes left. Just tell us briefly, you're a foundational resource in the world of spam, and by spam I don't mean the Monty Python version, but the email version. Tell us what you've done and where that sits in the world of email today.
Yeah, so first I would probably say a small point of clarification. I sit in the world of anti-spam. Yeah, so I love working with anti-spam. I love stopping spammers. It gives me a small amount of joy in my life, but I also enjoy reconciling my checkbook, and that gives me small joy too. So that's the kind of person I am. But spam is a big problem. Phishing attacks, things like that. Email security is where well over 80%, some people say as high as 90% of security attacks start. So it's a very important work, and I'm very proud of it. My research is incorporated in numerous corporate offerings, protecting well over 30% of the domains on the internet, and love doing it. You can find me on the internet. I'm known by the initials CAM, K-A-M. And that's how I battle spammers and try and keep them out of there. And I think it's the front gate for most security hacks, unfortunately.
And to be clear, you're not making this point, I don't think, but I think this is true. You're not making money out of this. You've volunteered essentially your resources and expertise around this.
Absolutely, yeah. I've done it since 2004, giving away our rule sets for free and working with the Apache Spam Assassin. And I love the Apache Software Foundation. I'm probably running out of time, but for those who don't know, the Apache Software Foundation is very intrinsic in the world today. The pitch I gave when I used to be the VP of fundraising for them is every plane in US airspace is tracked with Apache software. Every smartphone in the world has Apache software on it. And 80% of the websites on the world at least run some portion of our software. We have 380 open source projects under our umbrella. Some people only know the HTTPD project when they think of Apache, but we have many, many, many more.
So big contributor, part of that maker concept that you grew up being and participating in. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so it just remains for me to thank you for joining us. It's been a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Kevin, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Dr. Nick.
Thanks for joining me today. Do you have any better ideas, or have you found a small incremental change that's brought about a big improvement in your world? Let's continue the conversation on our hashtag, #TheIncrementalist, or share with me at DrNick1 on Twitter. You can find more information about the show on our program page at healthcarenowradio.com. And tune in next time to hear my discussions with leaders and innovators from around the globe who've revolutionized their space by using small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and I'm starting a revolution through evolution.